This is K.M. Wyland, and you are listening to the 627th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, 5 Ways to Use Your Character's Shadows to Power Your Story. Complex characters mirror real-life humans in their contradictions of inner light and dark. As writers, it is our job to create these contrasts in ways that become cohesive and thematically meaningful. One of the simplest and most effective ways to do this is to explore shadow theory. In last week's episode, we talked about the concept of the shadow, a phrase originated by C.G. Jung. The shadow refers to the parts of the self that are not present in the conscious personality or ego, but instead are hidden away in the dark of the unconscious. The concept of the shadow suggests that the parts of ourselves that are repressed or neglected in the unconscious actually wield tremendous power over us. Many different personality models offer tools for exploring these lost pieces of ourselves and doing shadow work to return them to our consciousness, so we can wield them consciously and reclaim their lost power. The MBTI, or Myers-Briggs system, which is based on Jung's idea of cognitive function polarities, talks about how you might be in the grip of your shadow functions. This can even cause you to momentarily seem to have a completely opposite personality, as discussed in Naomi L. Quank's book, Was That Really Me? Additionally, the Enneagram's entire philosophy is built around recognizing that our personality type is not us, and offers a map to expanding ourselves beyond the basic idea of our visible personalities. Because good stories explore the human psyche, and particularly catalysts of psychological change, writers can use any or all of these tools to write better character arcs. As we spoke about last week, shadow theory provides an incredibly simple and useful tool for immediately recognizing how a character's surface personality always points to corresponding shadow characteristics that can be explored in the story. So, in case you didn't listen to last week's show, or if you just want a quick refresher, here is a quick reminder of how shadow theory works. Simply, shadow theory suggests that whatever is most prominent in your character's conscious personality indicates that the exact opposite trait is probably lurking in the shadow. Last week, we talked about such polarities as strengths and weaknesses, for example, intelligence and stupidity, athleticism and clumsiness, self-sacrifice and selfishness. We also talked about fear and power, for example, fear of commitment and loyalty, fear of failure and ambition, fear of death and courage. We talked about conviction and hypocrisy, for example, someone who preaches the 7th commandment but hides an affair, or someone who blames big corporations' greed but cheats on the boss. And we talked about projections of hate or love onto others. For example, someone who believes women are weak but hides their own inner weakness, or someone who idolizes powerful authority figures but ignores the inner potential for their own empowerment. The great advantage of shadow theory is how easily it simplifies even complicated personalities by pointing to the inner dichotomies driving a person. However, it should go without saying you don't want to oversimplify a character. Not every instance of these traits, or others like them, will point to corresponding shadow traits. Double check yourself by asking how much the character identifies with these traits. If he is fluid and willing to entertain other points of view, or if he is genuinely self-deprecating and can even laugh at himself when a trait is pointed out, he is likely to be well-rounded in this area of life. This indicates the corresponding shadow issue has already been integrated into the conscious personality. However, if the personality seems particularly ossified around the trait in question, then you've probably stumbled upon the potential for shadow exploration. For example, if a character can't stand to have her selflessness questioned, or if he refuses to brook any argument about why he might not actually be as dumb as he insists he is, or if she refuses to examine her own inconsistencies or hypocrisies, or if he insists on seeing other people as the other rather than three-dimensional humans, These are all signs of what might be hanging out in the person's shadow. As Shadow Meister Robert Bly says, every part of our personality that we don't love will become hostile to us. So now that you understand how to use shadow theory to quickly identify characters' inner conflicts, today let's dive deeper. How can you practically apply this understanding of your character's shadows in your story? Here are 5 places in your story where you can use shadow theory to create amazing complexity and thematic resonance. So tip number 1, use your character's shadows to add realism and depth to their motivations. We often hear it said, conflict is story. But if we walk that back, we see that conflict is driven by the character's goals, by what they desire. And desire is created by motive. So really, we could just as easily say motivation is story. A solid motivation can make or break your story. As long as readers believe in your character's reasons for doing what they're doing, you can have your characters chasing after all kinds of bizarre goals, and readers will happily suspend disbelief. But if the motives don't make sense, then readers will scoff at even otherwise sensible actions. Motives are tricky, simply because they are often incredibly complex. We humans may want something for any number of reasons all at the same time. Sometimes we are conscious of those reasons, sometimes not. Sometimes we think we know why we're doing something, when really we're only partly conscious of our true motivations. That's where the shadow enters in. What lies in our unconscious is a powerful driver of our motivations. The reasons we desire a certain romantic relationship, or a particular job, or our independence, or a popular status symbol, are often driven as much by what's in the shadow as by the explanations offered by our conscious personalities. So consider your character's desires. What do they want? Now, consider their motivations. Why do they say they want this thing? Now, flip that claim on its head. What does shadow theory say they want and why they want it? For example, I used this one in my Gaslamp fantasy Wayfarer about a poor village lad determined to win the hand of an earl's granddaughter. His conscious reason for pursuing her is that he thinks she's beautiful and wonderful, but the unconscious reason, which he does not admit until the end, is that marrying her would ease his insecurities about his own low status as a blacksmith's apprentice. Tip number 2. Use your character's shadows to create secrets and suspense in their backstories. Backstory exists mainly to explain a character's motivations. We can create this via what John Truby calls the ghost in the character's past. The ghost is a catalytic event that has molded the character into exactly the sort of person who would want to achieve the plot's main goal. As its haunting name suggests, this motivating factor is often dramatic and even traumatic. It is also, almost inevitably, a signpost to when and why the character put some important part of her personality into the shadow. In real life, shadow work revolves around learning to see what's in one's own shadow. And this often requires a bit in the way of forensics. What occurred to cause this piece to end up locked in the cellar of the psyche? Examining your character's shadow can help you determine what backstory event might provide the best explanation for their main story motivation. And of course, you can also flip this and consider what a known backstory event might reasonably cause to end up in the character's shadow, where he doesn't have to acknowledge or identify with it. If you're writing a close or limited POV, then you know that one of the trickiest bits is finding ways to keep backstory secrets from readers, even though your narrating character was there when the ghost happened and therefore knows all about it. Understanding your character's shadow can help with that too. After all, the whole point of the shadow is that it is unconscious. Now, this doesn't mean your character is necessarily repressing her memory of events, but she may not have full consciousness of the what, why, and how of this event. For example, Atonement revolves around an event in the protagonist's childhood in which her own misconstrual of events led her to wrongly accuse a young man of rape. She spends the rest of her life wrestling with her perceptions, trying to understand them and make them right. Tip number 3. Use your character's shadows to bring subtext to potentially two-dimensional characters. In fiction, we usually want our protagonists to be good and our antagonists to be bad. However, these simple characterizations are almost always unsatisfying if that's all these characters are. Savvy readers want to experience characters who mimic all the rainbowed complexity of real life. Exploring your character's shadows allows you to round them out. So when writing good characters, you can flip their best traits on their heads and explore the repressed shadow qualities that carry the opposite charge. Same goes for your bad characters. A quick application of shadow theory reveals how even their most wicked traits bring with them the shadow of the opposite virtue. Rounding out your characters in this way does not mean they need to act out these opposite traits in the story, although one or two such actions will often bring depth. However, simply by exploring the inner conflict your characters experience within themselves over these unintegrated traits, you can create a lasting effect of complexity. For example, in Blade Runner, the inhuman baddie exhibits more humanity in his appreciation of life as he dies in the rain than does the protagonist Deckard, who heartlessly executes him as part of his job. Tip number 4. Use your character's shadows to deepen theme by adding nuance. Theme arises from the contrast between a character's actions in the external plot and his inner conflict, and potentially his growth. In other words, theme arises from the contrast between a character's conscious and unconscious. Now, a positive change arc is all about growing a character's consciousness of her shadow traits, so she can integrate them into and thereby expand her conscious personality. Negative change arcs, on the other hand, highlight the character's resistance to exploring the shadow and his ultimate failure to expand his consciousness as a result. The best character arcs create deeply nuanced themes exactly because they delve into the polarities and dichotomies of the shadow. Good thematic explorations examine all sides of an issue, or at least 4, as in Robert McKee's thematic square. Understanding how to use shadow theory to plumb your character's unconscious motivations can help you figure out which topics are organic to your story's plot and character arcs, so you can make sure you're not missing out on any of the most important contrasting pairs. For example, in many ways, Wuthering Heights is an exploration of the shadow made manifest as the ruthless cruelty and prejudice that is acted out unconsciously, in the sense that they do not own their actions as such, by the characters early in the story, then becomes consciously personified in the vengeance of the orphaned and unloved Heathcliff. And tip number 5. Use your character's shadows to create thematically resonant minor characters. Minor characters are particularly important for fleshing out the thematic depth of your story's world. There are several ways you can use shadow theory to influence how you craft your supporting cast. Option number 1, examine your minor characters' shadows. You don't want your supporting characters to be two-dimensional any more than you do your main players. And in some way, creating three-dimensional minor characters can be even trickier, since you must convince readers of their depth with much less explanation. Looking to your minor characters' shadows to examine their inherent dichotomies is a quick and easy way to bring life to even a walk-on role. Option number 2, examine minor characters' thematic roles. Your supporting cast is one of your most important tools in fleshing out your thematic argument. So choose characters who can act out various aspects of the theme that your protagonist is wrestling with. Some characters should represent conscious personality aspects of the theme. Others should represent shadow potentialities, both light and dark. And option number 3, examine how your protagonist projects shadow traits onto minor characters. So finally, use minor characters to exemplify how your protagonist may not be taking ownership of her own shadow traits. Because whatever is in the shadow is unconscious, the person will often project these traits onto others, believing, for instance, that others are stupid or angry or untrustworthy, or perhaps even angelic or fearless or strong, when really these traits are arising from the person's own unconscious. It is possible, of course, that the minor characters are embodying these traits to some degree, but this only enhances their ability within the story to mirror the protagonist and her own unconscious proclivities or potentialities. For example, Toy Story is built around the shadows of main character Woody, who projects onto cheerfully oblivious newcomer Buzz his own insecurities that he is just a toy to his beloved owner Andy, as well as his need to be in charge. In so many ways, a story is primarily an exploration of humanity's collective shadow. We use stories as a way to express the contents of our own unconscious, but also as a tool to recognize our shared shadows and to do the shadow work of reclaiming all parts of ourselves. Understanding this important aspect of the psyche provides an incisive tool for rounding out our stories. So I hope you will stop by the site and chime in on this. Where and how do your characters' shadows show up in your story? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.